Today we have our toughest test in the speedrun so far. Hello everyone, my name is Alex, I'm a 2000 rated over-the-board chess player, and in this series we're going from 1000 to 2000 elo in chess.com rapid games, and during the games I'll be explaining my thought process as best as I possibly can for your education and entertainment. In today's game we're against Victor Moon Falcon from Canada, and we have a Caro Kann Defense. This is our highest rated opponent of the series so far, and hopefully I'll be able to show you exactly how to use the Caro Kann to take down players of this rating. My opponent opts for the Advance variation. There's loads of different things you can do. The Advance is often considered to be the best way for white to fight for an advantage. And here, black can go bishop to f5, or black can play the move c5. My opponent has offered me a draw, which I don't really understand. He goes c3. c3 is a fine move. We're going to play knight to c6. And knight to f3, which is the most natural response, isn't a fantastic move. My opponent plays h3, which is not the main move, but it's a decent move. The idea is that the reason knight to f3 isn't that good is because black can go takes and bishop g4, pinning the knight. The point of h3 is that I obviously can't play bishop to g4 now. However, I'm still going to take, because of course the queen can't take, because my knight is hitting the pawn. And then we can probably just go bishop f5 and e6 and play a normal game. We could go queen b6, but it feels completely unnecessary. So I'm going to play bishop f5. These kinds of ideas do exist in some lines because of the bishop's scope on the c2 square. But for now, we don't really have to be too concerned about that. We're just going to play the move e6. And we're going to claim that white's h3 move is a waste of time, essentially. And my opponent goes a3 as well, which obviously that stops knight to b4, but my opponent could always just meet knight to b4 with bishop b5 check, and just cause us immense problems with our king's safety. So I feel like a3 is a bit of a waste of time. White can justify it with moves like b4. We can go queen to b6 here, going after the d4 pawn, but just knight to f3, I don't really see what we're doing there. Rook c8 is also a good move, a6 is also a good move. One of the problems with this line, with the bishop on f5, is our knight can't really go to the f5 square where it would typically like to go. Normally with the bishop on g4, we'll have the knight coming to f5, the bishop to e7, and then we can castle. Now, our pieces are a little bit discoordinated because of my opponent playing the move h3. But we can still continue to play normal moves. a6 is something that I think I do like, and I'm going to play it. The reason is that I want to restrict this bishop's ability to come to its most natural square. And I'm basically offering my opponent the move bishop to d3 and saying, look, that's your most active move, because I'm happy to trade this bishop off because I want my knight on f5 anyway. If my knight were to go to like g6, they'd kind of be getting in each other's way, and moves like g4 could be problematic. My opponent goes knight f3 though, keeps things flexible. We could play rook c8, queen b6 would also be a decent move. I think we're going to start with knight g to e7, because the knight will be coming to this square regardless. And my opponent does play the move bishop d3, which is exactly what we want. Now, I think I might start with rook c8, because I want him to take me so I can take back with the knight. Of course, I could take him and then go knight f5, but not only have I allowed my opponent to develop his queen by taking a piece as well, but my knight has to spend an extra move going to f5. Queen b6 also looks like a decent move to avoid having to make this trade and continue developing. Of course, I can't develop my dark squared bishop until this knight does move. I could play the move h6 to restrict this bishop's movement to the g5 square, which is always a decent move in these lines, and I'm tempted to play it. I'm going to go for it, because bishop g5 can sometimes be annoying. And with the moves a6 and h6, I essentially have stopped the bishops from coming to their potentially most active diagonals. Like, this bishop probably has to go on the e3 square now and just perform defensive duties, which it does. Queen b6 looks very tempting. Very, very tempting. I could take and go knight to f5. followed by bishop e7 and castles. That's completely reasonable. I could even play bishop g6 followed by knight to f5. But if bishop g6, I think my opponent just takes, and then my knight's on g6, and it doesn't want to go on g6, it wants to go on the f5 square. So queen b6 is tempting. Taking is also tempting, followed by knight to f5. I think my queen is going to come to the b6 square regardless, though. My opponent could go knight to a4, but I feel like the knight is a little bit misplaced on the a4 square. Maybe it isn't. Maybe it isn't. Maybe it can sneak into c5. I don't know. I don't feel confident in that plan for white. Maybe I should be. But, like, I don't know. Queen c7, if the knight comes into c5, all I have to do is exchange and then take on c5. And the e5 pawn will be very weak if the d pawn takes. My opponent takes on f5, which is exactly what we want, of course. Now he maybe will go for this knight to a4 move. I don't... Oh my god, I nearly pre-moved queen takes b2. That could have been horrific. Okay, queen d2. Cool. I feel like... Well, knight a4 I can now just meet with queen to b3, and if knight to c5 I can just take it. And these pawns look very weak. Very, very weak. And the bishop will be weak on e3 if my queen gets to b3 as well, and the knight moves. That will not be good, because this queen no longer controls this diagonal. So I think just bishop e7 looks like the most logical move. I suppose I could actually play the move knight to a5, trying to get into b3 to fork the queen and the rook, or c4 to fork everything. The thing is, I really want to get castled. However, there's no danger to my king on this diagonal. If knight to a5, knight to a4 attacks my queen, and my knight is under attack, which puts me off that plan a little bit. So yeah, we'll start with bishop to e7. I think this is a little bit dubious. Okay, b4. It does stop my knight to a5 plan. He may be trying to go for this, which would be reasonable. I can't really stop him. There's no discoveries with my knight moving and my rook hitting the knight because it's defended. So I think I'm just going to castle. And my opponent may well go for knight to a4 here. No, he goes rook c1. Okay. Maybe a5. Trying to play on the fact that this pawn is now no longer defended. If a5, knight a4, queen b5, knight c5, then this pawn hangs. The b pawn hangs in that line because we have way too much pressure on it. Yeah, and also d4 could become weak. I mean, we are hitting it 3 times already. If one of these pieces moves away from the defense of d4, it could definitely fall. Yeah, I think a5 is the most logical move here. And we did actually have, in the speed run previously, a somewhat similar game to this in terms of the queenside play. Except our king is castled in this game, which makes things a bit different. My opponent goes b5. If knight to a7, a4, well, then we have like bishop b4, and I quite like that position. Our knight is a bit out of the game, but we could always reroute it via c8 and b6. We could take, but that seems... Well, he can't take here because I'll take his queen. So take, 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 take. I don't think I have the compensation there. I don't think I've got enough compensation. I think I have to play this move. Okay. Not that pretty, but yeah, we do gain access to b4. Also access to c4. We could even double rooks like this. But I think starting with bishop b4 makes sense. So our bishop isn't really doing a whole lot. Also with g4, normally with the bishop on e7, you go knight to h4, supported by the bishop. But now, because our bishop's moved, we'd be able to go knight to e7. And that wouldn't be a problem. By the way, if you're enjoying the video so far, please drop a like and subscribe if you haven't already. I would really appreciate it. Helps to keep me motivated to keep making more of these videos for you guys. And if you haven't seen the previous episodes of the speedrun, maybe this is your first time on the channel, then make sure you check out the playlist down below after this video. My opponent goes queen d3, of course unpinning the queen, playing very, very quickly. Very quickly. We need to solve the problem with this knight. I'm tempted with rook to c4, but then knight d2 attacks my rook, which I don't love. So maybe we just go rook c7. But then even if the knight goes to c8, where's it going next? Like, it's not obvious, because rook c7 would stop my queen from going to c7. We are a little bit cramped here, for sure. A little bit cramped. Maybe we take on c3. Rook takes, queen takes, rook c8, queen back to d3, let's say. Then rook c4 actually attacks the pawn. So I'm going to do it. Normally you don't want to trade off a bishop like this, but my thought process is that it helps us to speed up our development. We get our rook into the game quickly, supported by our knight. And then we get the rook to the desired square. Knight d2 no longer works because this pawn hangs. My opponent could go queen to b3 to preemptively defend the pawn. He doesn't. He goes queen to b2, which does support a rook to c1 move, which is probably the idea, but I don't think it works that well. After rook c4, if my opponent plays rook to c1, not only could we play queen c7, supporting and preparing knight c8, knight b6 to hit a4, but also I think we can probably just take on a4, because I mean we cover the c8 square anyway. My opponent goes queen a1, which is a very ugly move. This bishop is hanging at all times. We are also almost threatening to take the pawn. We have a lot of pressure, but my opponent is currently defending it. Now we need to get this knight to a better square, really. That's the issue with our position. And I think the knight belongs on b6, because these squares are very, very strong looking. So I think queen c7 makes the most sense. I think queen c7 should be played. We just support the rook. You know, we control the c-file. My opponent can play rook to c1 to try and counteract our control of the c-file, because it's defended by two pieces. But we do have some interesting lines with like taking the bishop, forcing our opponent to take here. So let's say rook c1, knight here. If you take, then we take and we win the game. So if rook c1, knight e3, rook c4 hitting our queen, queen c4, pawn e3. This looks very difficult for white. We could probably just go knight c8, knight b6 and hit the a4 pawn. And there's quite a few weaknesses in the white position. We dominate the only open file. The white king is maybe a little bit weak. And that looks completely winning. Completely winning. I mean, there will certainly be conversion. Like, we'll have to convert the position properly, but we definitely have a massive positional advantage there. I mean, these pawns will be doubled up if f takes e3. We would control the only open file. Our opponent does go g4, which makes a lot of sense. Taking the bishop seems logical, because now we dominate the c-file. I didn't really want to take the bishop because it's not a great piece, but we need to dominate this c-file, I think. We could even play rook to e3, sorry, c3 here, targeting the e3 pawn, followed by maybe queen c4, like infiltrating. I feel like knight c8, knight b6 is the most logical thing to do, just to apply pressure. I mean, can our opponent even do anything? Can go like g5 maybe? And if takes, then of course knight takes, and we have problems on f7. If knight c8, g5, h5, if g6 we take and we're fine, so that's not a problem. h5 is difficult for white to target because of the, like, there's like two diagonal squares the knight's got to go to, and geometrically it takes ages for the knight to target that that square. It's just a geometric pattern. I think that works. Again, we could play the move rook to c3 and g5 can still be met with h5. We could put the knight on e7, but I don't think that makes sense. If with rook to c3, surely our opponent has to go rook e1. I mean, if you go... Oh, maybe queen e1. And then you shift the queen over to the king side, and that's a bit scary. f6 is funny, because if takes, then queen g3 and black wins. But of course, white will not take. And then if we take, then knight takes, and we're probably losing. Yeah, if rook here, then just queen here, that's a bit of a problem. So I'm going to go knight c8. We need to get this knight back into the game somehow anyway. You could argue, well, why don't you just put more pressure on that pawn, and then the knight can take on b5 and get back into the game. But I don't think that's very realistic. I think we'll be spending a very long time doing that, and in the meantime, white can maybe try and make something happen on the king side. Knight d2, that is definitely a move that we want to see. That is fantastic. The knight now does not pose any kind of threat to our king. Of course, trying to kick the rook off of the active square. If rook b4, then rook c1. So we can't put the rook on b4. Rook c3 makes sense. Queen e1 defends. Rook c2 looks a bit more tasty. If queen e1, the knight is threatened. We have like queen to c3, and that looks really difficult. Rook f2. Then we have rook c1 winning the queen. So that looks really promising. If knight to b3, targeting our a5 pawn, I don't think I'm particularly scared of that. He does go for it. We could just play the move b6, which does mean that our knight can now no longer go to b6. But if we don't, the knight's also got the potential to come to c5. This is a very good maneuver from my opponent, though, because I assume he's going to play rook c1, because the knight now supports this square, which is very clever. I think after rook c1, we probably have to go knight to e7, and if take, then if queen here, we can take the knight, and we stop queen c8 check. So we have to move the knight. It makes absolutely zero sense to take this rook, because white gets exactly what he wants. In this position, I mean, structurally, we're very, very similar, because the only difference is that white has double d-pawns. Queen to b1 is a very logical move. Very good move. Now we have to make a decision. I'm tempted to play rook c3. To try and decline the trade for a little bit longer. I don't think it's particularly good, though. If we do trade, this knight doesn't have a way into our queen side, though, and we can maybe try and grind down the endgame. We do have rook c4, which is also worth noting. I mean, if take... The queen can't challenge our queen, because queen c1, we take the knight on b3. If rook here, the knight can't go to d2, because we'll take the rook. If rook here, the queen can't go to d3. Yeah, I think this is the move. This has to be the move. Because we're literally just trying to keep control of the c-file at all costs. And because of the weakness of this knight, if we ever have this exchange, it becomes basically impossible for my opponent's queen to offer a trade while defending the knight. It basically can't happen. Which means that our queen and rook should be able to occupy all three of white's pieces, which should allow our knight to cause a bit of mayhem on the king side, potentially. Although I'm not sure exactly where it ought to go. I mean, g6 makes the most sense, but after h4, where are we going? There's no obvious path. King f2 is a very strange move, but okay. Obviously, we can't take this because our queen hangs. h5 is tempting. If takes, then we have knight f5, which looks strong, but our opponent can, of course, just not take, and we're not threatening anything. Like, taking here doesn't really do a thing. Knight g6. Where are we going after knight g6, though? Well, we could potentially go... It's a long-winded plan, but knight f8, knight h7, knight g5, and knight e4. That would be very strong. I don't think there's a quicker way to this square because we have to access it via g5. We can only get to g5 via h7. We can only get to h7 via f8. And we can only get to f8 via g6. So we have to do this very strange knight dance to avoid all of the pawns. But, like I said before, if we can keep the queenside frozen, if all these pieces just have to stay still, right, and not do anything, then we may have time to execute this plan. We may have time. Now, after knight to f8, my opponent may try a move like h4 to try and shut down this idea, but that would be incredibly weakening. That would be really, really weakening, and it would stop our initial plan, but I don't think it's a long-term solution. Okay, yeah, that doesn't really do anything. So let's continue. Knight f8. Again, if take, we're golden. My opponent may be trying to do something like knight takes a5 and force the b-pawn through, but if he ever does this, we can always just take his rook. And then rook c2 is threatened, so that never works anyway. I mean, if knight c6 in that line, well, we can just play a move like rook h1 maybe, or just rook back to c4, or even sack the rook for the knight. We have loads of different options there. That's not really concerning. If h4, we could actually potentially shift our queen to a square like e7 anyway, or maybe even trade rooks and then queen e7. He does go h4. If queen e7, rook h1, that looks bad, because then we can just take here. Also, queen e7, if king g3, we could take on a4. Although we do allow rook c1, which I don't love. If here, the knight could go back to g6, threatening queen h4. Rook h1 would be forced. I don't see how we continue there, though. Knight h7 doesn't really make any sense anymore, because we can't access the square that we want. f6 wouldn't be a silly move, although the pawn is protected by the queen from afar. Basically, the point is, if my opponent takes, we can infiltrate on h2, and we probably win the game. This is interesting. We could go knight g6. If h5, well, then we can just go back, and we can get into g5. If here and king here, then maybe f6, because the pawn is pinned. And if h5, the pawn is still pinned, we could just drop back. Interesting. Very interesting. Let's go knight g6 and ask the question. I don't think time is too much of a problem. Yeah, this isn't convincing to me. This is not convincing. Because now we can get into g5. And also, we can play a move like queen e7 trying to infiltrate whenever we want. No, this can't work. This can't work. No chance. Our knight's going to get into e4. And that looks like it's going to be game over. This is very interesting positional play here. Because we are basically occupying 3 of white's pieces with 2 of our pieces. And it means that we have 1 piece that can do whatever it wants, but its options are very limited. So we're really just trying to make the most of it. The king is wide open, but we can't really exploit it. There's nothing we can really do. So we're going to go knight to g5, and knight to e4 will come with a check. This knight can't go to d2 to control this square because the king is on d2. This should be almost game over. Almost game over. If rook takes, we could even throw this in first. We could even throw in the check first as a little Zwischenstück. I think that's how you pronounce it. And then just queen takes c4 and everything is under attack. Everything is under attack. Our king is very, very safe. Very safe, because It can't be checked on the back rank anyway, because we dominate the c-file. Let's throw this check in. Don't have to worry about king to d3, because we can still take, because we have 2 attackers on the rook. And, I mean, maybe we didn't have to play knight to e4 first, but that's surely where the knight's going to go. Okay. Now we take. Queen c1 can't be played because you hang the knight. This is what I was saying before. If the rooks come off, my queen can still completely dominate the queen and knight because the queen has to defend the knight. And any queen trade hangs the knight, right? And now our knight controls some really, really useful squares. And I don't know, a move like queen to d3, for example, might pose some problems. Knight d2 played. Interesting. If we take it, well, we can take on a4. I don't really think I want to ruin my pawn structure with d takes e4, because then my opponent's d pawn could be a problem. We could play queen to c3, which almost forces a queen trade. And if take, then a4 is under attack, and it can't be defended. But I feel like the queen endgame is winning. Let me just think a second. Here, this is under attack. Here, here, here. Check. If queen f1, take. No, I'm not convinced. Oh, let me think. Queen d3. Well, obviously hitting e3. White has to take my knight. That's the only move. I mean, we could even just take and maintain our threats, but I think we probably have to take on e3 first. Queen e2 is the only move. Check. If the king moves, we take on d4 with check. Although if king d1, then knight d2. I think I'm just going to take it. I'm just going to take the knight. I don't really care that much about this e3 pawn, or I don't think I should, because the a4 pawn is so much more important. Because now we hit b5, and we have a passed a pawn, which is also protected. Protected passed a pawn. Again, if the queen tries to come to c3, for example, to try and get into the c-file, I don't think he can. Okay, let's give a check. We could give this check to force the queen trade, but then the king just gobbles up the pawn. So maybe we push. But then queen here, take. He still can't infiltrate properly. We always have h7. Okay, my opponent resigns. Yeah, I don't think there was any way out for him there. Just because we push the pawn and there is literally nothing he can do. So, although pushing first seems wrong. Interesting. I guess the engine analysis will be able to tell us more. So let's get the game review on and see where we could have gone better and where we did go correctly. Okay, well, this is very interesting because it seems like there were a lot of misses in this middle game from both players. This would be very interesting to see. But it looks like the opening was essentially perfect. e5, c5, c3, knight c6, h3. h3 is played because my opponent wants to do this, but you can't do it immediately because take bishop g4 and you have some problems. You can't really do this because of this. So my opponent goes h3 first, but it's a little bit slow. You should probably play bishop b5. cd4, bishop f5 is the best move, getting the bishop outside the pawn chain because we want to play the move e6. Knight c3, e6, a3 is actually the best move, interestingly. I mean, if knight f3 here, bishop e4 is a move. And if take, then we just win the d4 pawn. So And I suppose we get the same thing as bishop g4. Like, we just attack the knight. It's the same thing. So a3, a6 is the best move. Awesome. Knight f3, knight g to e7, bishop d3, rook c8. We're playing this essentially perfectly. So if you play the Caro Kann, or want to play the Caro Kann, I don't think it's big-headed for me to say I'm pretty good at it. I don't think that's big-headed. Because I think I was able to explain the reasoning for my moves very well. Because I don't think memorizing moves is that great of an idea in a lot of openings. So I try to explain why I'm playing the moves I'm playing, because then you're far more likely to remember it and be able to counter bad moves. My opponent castles. h6 is a good move. Bishop takes d3 is also playable, but I don't think we have to do it just yet. Bishop e3 is not the best. Knight e2 is better, but... Sorry. This knight to e2. That's d2. Which I suppose makes sense. Maybe shifting the knight to the king's side, but bishop e3 is more natural. Queen b6 is a mistake. Okay. So this is where we make our first mistake. The computer likes take in knight f5, and I suppose it literally just wants to play bishop e7 castles. And if something like rook c1, knight a5 is an idea. I don't know. I would recommend bishop e7, to be honest, just getting castled first. If something like rook after d1, castles, if like b4 is played, then a5. If b5, then this pawn is weak apparently. We take on e3 first, fe3, bishop a3. It does want to go for this line, really. cb7, here, rook b8. And the computer thinks that the rook is better than the two knights. Maybe just because it's such an open board. Knight a4 looks nice, trying to get to c5. If here, knight c5, rook b5, I suppose we have the passed a pawn as well. Very interesting. Queen b6 is not quite the right idea because of knight a4, which I was admittedly concerned about, and I was just going to have to retreat the queen. Bit of an oversight. But my opponent doesn't punish me. He takes on f5, knight f5, queen d2. Here, knight a5 immediately was better. I was concerned about knight a4, but the computer just says go queen b5, which I did see, but I was just like, it's not really a natural square for the queen. But I suppose something like this, and we're fine. Knight c4, this is just quite a nice position, I guess. Like, knight takes to defend the b2 pawn. King d7 is the best move. That's pretty funny. But okay, we go bishop e7. So not the best, but not bad at all. b4, castles, rook ac1, which does allow a5, which is the best move. So I'm very happy I saw this. I expected my opponent to play knight to a4. Here, I just thought queen b5. If the knight comes in, then this pawn is too weak. And yeah, it is too weak. I can just take it. This isn't really a problem. No, sorry. We can play b6. And, you know, the knight, let's say it retreats. We can take here. We can take here. We can play rook a8. We've got a very nice position. But after b5, the computer wants to go for this line again. And I saw this line. And I thought, well, after this, you can't take here because I'll take your queen. So rook c1, rook c6. Again, we have... what? A rook for... what do we have? A rook and two pawns for a knight and a bishop. I suppose this bishop sucks. This knight kind of sucks. If a move like knight to a4, trade the rooks, queen b4. I guess these pawns are just too powerful. It's difficult to really go for this if you don't know that it's good, though. But I will bear that in mind for future games, and hopefully you guys do as well. That is an idea. Knight a7 essentially equalizes the position. a4? Bishop b4 is an inaccuracy, really. Computer likes rook c4. Why did I reject this? There was a reason I didn't like it. I can't remember why. I go bishop b4. I think my idea was that the knight just can't move. The computer's move is g4. which I did mention in the game, because normally the knight goes to h4 after g4, but here the bishop no longer controls that square. So we'd have to take or retreat. Let's say takes, queen takes in this line, unpinning. Rook c4, then there's knight d2 maybe. Computer thinks this is good for black. If we can solve the problem of our knight on a7, we're just winning, which is kind of what happened in the game. Queen d3, bishop c3, rook c3, rook c3, queen c3, rook c8. I liked this move order because I can play rook c4. Rook c1 is not really viable because of this. Also, there was... sorry, in this position, this is not the best move. Knight c8 immediately is better. And if this... Now queen c7. I don't really understand why the move order matters. No, I don't understand. Rook b1 threatens this, but I thought I still can go knight c8. Computer wants bishop d2. Knight b6 can be met with bishop takes. Rook c2. Rook b2, and white manages to hold on. Funny move, knight b6 here. You can't take because your queen gets forked. And if here and this first, queen c2, if bishop a5, I assume... Okay, you just take on a4. Makes sense. My opponent goes g4, though, which allows knight to e3. My opponent basically loses a move, and we get to play knight c8, which is exactly what we wanted. Knight d2 is not the way forward. I thought g5 was testing. The computer likes the idea of g5. And if you take, then like the tables completely shift. Completely shift. So my plan here was probably h5. Apparently g6 works. I didn't think this worked. Although I guess white's just still trying to get in. So what's the better idea? Knight e7. And if gh6, knight f5, you just ignore it and go after white's position. I suppose you can use the pawn as like an umbrella pawn as well. Very interesting. f6 is now an idea as well, which I pointed out several times during the game. It can't be taken because the queen infiltrates. But okay. My opponent goes knight d2. We don't have to worry about all that. It's just not the right plan. It's not the right plan. Rook c2. Knight b3. Again, it just doesn't really do anything. b6 is a mistake. Queen c4 is stronger. Ah, because of this. Very nice. Completely missed that idea. We go b6. Nice and solid, though. Rook c1. Knight e7. Again, the computer likes queen c4, but if you take me, then, like, you're screwed. Because your knight is under attack. And if you defend the knight, then you're never getting rid of my queen. Queen c1 can never be played because the knight will hang. And you're not infiltrating anyway. Even if you were, I'd just have king h7 and the attack is over. So queen b1. Rook c4. Rook c3 is slightly better, but rook c4 I liked just because it's anchored in by a pawn as well. I also thought that rook c3 you can play this. And we have to go back to c4 anyway. So I'm not really sure what the difference is. Rook c4. King f2. I mean... King g2 is apparently the best move. Realistically, how is white defending this position? Computer wants to move f6, which I did see. But I thought that white could ignore me. Something like, I don't know, well, take, then we take here with tempo. Something like this, I thought might work. And if here... Oh, then we just have knight g6. I think I just got a bit nervous about opening my king up on the f-file, but realistically it doesn't really matter because white's never infiltrating. Okay. Well, I saw it existed. I should have taken it a bit more seriously. We go knight g6, and I thought this was an interesting plan. My opponent goes queen b2, knight f8, h4, knight back to g6 is a mistake, queen e7 is better. I couldn't figure out what to do in this position, though. Here I couldn't figure it out. Queen b4? And we just switch our focus entirely. h5, knight f8, g5. We have to bring the queen back or go rook c3. Rook c3 is more realistic. Queen f2. This just isn't my kind of chess. This is very tetchy. Very tetchy, because this does look dangerous. I go knight g6. And my idea was to bait the move h5 and literally just go back and make this maneuver happen, which I thought was very smart. King e2 apparently is a mistake. King e1 apparently is the best move. Yeah, alright then. Alright. Again, f6 is the move the computer wants, but I go for this plan. Knight g5, rook c4. Knight e4 check is a miss. I guess maybe because it allows this. It's still losing, though. It's still completely losing. Yeah, the computer wants to take here first. And then I guess white's caught in like a limbo, because you can't play this because of check. If you play this, again we have check. And if the king retreats here, if this, just this, and white's position is falling apart. But okay, we go for this line. And to be fair, I was correct. Queen to d3 was worse. I calculated this, and I thought, well, if something like take, 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 it doesn't really work. And if queen g1 I saw, and I thought queen f1, this is just a repetition. That's no good. And if queen d4, the knight survives. My best thing that I can do here is repeat. So it doesn't quite work. It doesn't quite work. If here the king were to go to d2, then it would work, because this would come with check. And then I can take the knight, and then it's game over. Pretty much. I can probably just keep checking and take with the pawn, actually. But my opponent finds knight d2, and we take it. King takes. Queen a4. King d3. I mean, my opponent doesn't have anything. I give a check on c4. Oh, I had this. Forcing the king out, and then I can take on g4, which is interesting. But I just played this, and then my plan was a4, but my opponent resigned. If a4 here, queen a3, queen b5. I mean, even if the queen gets into my position, like, there's nothing. There's absolutely nothing. Like, even if you get this, I'm probably still fine after queen b1, defending the g6 square with tempo. Something like a2. Game is over. Game is over. So not a perfectly executed game, but I think a very nice example of the Caro Kann going correctly in kind of a non-standard fashion as well. A bit of a non-standard way that white played this. A viable way, but non-standard. And hopefully the explanations were very useful. If you want to see the previous episodes of the speedrun, then check out the playlist down here. And if you want to see another really cool Caro Kann game, then check out the video up here. Thank you very much for watching.